July 14th, 1944. The truck rattled down a dirt road that cut through 12,000 acres of scrub brush in Mesquite. Inside, 17 boys sat in silence. German prisoners of war.
We have to go, go,
Children,
go!
really.
Stay calm, we're
The
not
oldest
leaving
was
yet.
16.
But they're coming,
The
please!
youngest
I know,
had just
trust
turned
me.
14. They had been told what awaited them in Texas. Nazi propaganda officers in the transit camps had been very clear. American cowboys were savages, lawless killers who dragged prisoners behind horses for sport. The boys would be worked to death under the merciless sun, beaten for the smallest infractions, starved until their bodies gave out. Franz Muller, 15 years old, former Hitler Youth from Stuttgart, pressed his face against the metal slats of the truck bed and watched Texas pass by. Endless, flat, alien. Nothing like the orderly forests and neat villages of home. This was wilderness. And in wilderness, the propaganda said only the strong survived through cruelty. His hands bore blisters from Hitler Youth training, marching drills, rifle assembly, ideological instruction. They had taught him that Germans were destined to rule, that weakness was sin, that surrender was worse than death. Yet here he was, surrendered, captured in France without firing a shot, shipped across an ocean to work for the enemy. Beside him sat Otto Schneider, 16, a harmonica player from the Ruhr Valley whose father had died in a bombing raid. Otto had stopped talking 3 days ago, just stared with hollow eyes that had seen too much too young. Across from them, Klaus Weber, 14, still believed they might escape, might steal horses and ride to Mexico, might find a way back to Germany to keep fighting. The boy still had faith in the Führer, in final victory, in all the lies Berlin had fed them. The truck slowed. Through the slats, Franz saw a gate, rough wooden posts, no guards, no machine gun towers. Just an open gate and a dirt path leading to buildings that shimmered in the heat. The truck stopped. The engine died. In the sudden silence, they could hear nothing but wind and the distant lowing of cattle. No shouts, no orders, just wind. The tailgate dropped. Light flooded in, blinding after hours in the dim truck bed. A figure stood silhouetted against the Texas sky, tall, bow-legged, hat brim shading his face. "Out," a voice said, not shouted, just stated, American accented, but with something else underneath, something Slavic maybe. The boys climbed down stiffly. Their legs had cramped during the long drive from the processing camp in Houston. They stood in a ragged line, blinking in the brutal sunlight, waiting for what came next. The man who had spoken was 63 years old, though he looked older. His face was weathered leather, creased by decades of sun and wind. His hands were huge, scarred, capable. He wore dusty jeans, a faded work shirt, boots that had been resoled more times than replaced. This was Russell Kowalski, called Rusty by everyone who knew him. Ranch foreman, Polish immigrant, cowboy for 40 years across 3 states. He looked at the 17 boys with eyes that had seen everything: droughts and floods, bulls that killed men, horses that broke bones. He had buried friends, broken colts, taught green hands. He knew what fear looked like, and he saw it now in every face before him. Behind Rusty stood 3 other men, cowboys, ranch hands. They watched with expressions that ranged from curiosity to hostility to simple indifference. These were men who judged by work, not words. The boys would prove themselves or they would not. Simple as that. Rusty spoke again. His voice was quiet but carried weight. "You're here to work. We need hands. You need something to do besides rot in a camp. You follow rules, you work hard, you'll be treated fair. You cause trouble, you'll be sent back. Clear." The boys stared. Some understood enough English to catch the meaning. Others just nodded because nodding seemed safe. "Good," Rusty said. He gestured toward a long, low building. "Bunkhouse, get settled. We start at dawn." That was it. No speech about the enemy, no threats, no demonstrations of power, just simple instruction delivered in a tone that suggested competence mattered more than nationality. The boys filed toward the bunkhouse, unsure what to make of this. Where was the cruelty? Where were the chains? Where was the torture they had been promised? The bunkhouse was simple but clean. Rows of cots with thin mattresses, shelves for belongings, though most boys had nothing to put on them. A potbelly stove for winter, though it was July and winter felt impossibly far away. Windows without glass, just screens to keep out insects. Franz chose a cot near the door. Old habits, Always know your exit. Otto took the one beside him. Klaus went to the far corner, still suspicious, still looking for threats. That night they were given food. Not much. Beans, cornbread, coffee so strong it could strip paint. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and no one had to fight for their portion. The boys ate in silence, watching the cowboys who ate at a separate table. The ranch hands talked quietly among themselves. Occasionally one would glance at the Germans, but without the hatred Franz expected. Just assessment, the way you might look at a new horse. Evaluating potential. After dinner, Rusty approached their table. He set down a stack of papers and a pencil. Names, he said. Everyone writes their name. English letters. The boys complied, each writing carefully. Rusty collected the papers, studied them, nodded. Franz, he said, pointing. Otto, Klaus, Heinrich, Josef. He went through all 17, mangling some pronunciations but making the effort, acknowledging that they were individuals, not just prisoners. Then he pointed to himself. Rusty. He pointed to the other cowboys in turn. Jimmy, Walt, Hector. The introductions were simple, perfunctory, but they mattered. They were the first step towards something neither side expected: humanity. That first night in the bunkhouse, Franz could not sleep. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Texas night. Crickets, wind, somewhere in the distance a coyote howl. He thought about his mother in Stuttgart, about whether she was alive, about whether their apartment building still stood after the bombing raids. The letters from home had stopped 3 months ago. He did not know if she had survived. He thought about his older brother Hans, who had joined the Wehrmacht at 17 and died at Stalingrad. Hans, who had believed every word of Nazi propaganda. Hans, who had written letters home about glory and victory right up until the letters stopped coming. Franz had worshipped his brother, had wanted to be just like him, strong, brave, certain. But Hans was dead and Franz was alive, and nothing made sense anymore. Beside him, Otto played his harmonica so softly Franz could barely hear it. A melody from home, something about the Rhine River and lost love. The sound was mournful and achingly beautiful in the darkness. They're going to work us to death, Klaus whispered from his corner. This is how it starts. They fatten us up, then they break us. Franz wanted to believe Klaus was wrong, but he had no evidence. Just a feeling. A sense that Rusty's quietness was different from the screaming of Wehrmacht officers, that the cowboys' indifference was preferable to the hatred he had expected. But feelings meant nothing. Only time would tell. Dawn came early and hot. Rusty appeared in the bunkhouse doorway as the first light touched the horizon. Up, he said, not shouted, just stated. The boys dressed quickly. They had been soldiers in training, if not in combat. They knew how to wake and move efficiently. They assembled outside the bunkhouse in rough formation, old habits dying hard. Rusty looked at the formation and shook his head. This ain't the army. No formations. Just work. Follow me. He led them to a building that smelled of leather and hay and animal sweat. The tack room, saddles hung on wooden racks, bridles dangled from hooks. Blankets were folded on shelves. Everything was worn but well maintained. Tools cared for by men who understood that their lives depended on their equipment. Rusty pointed to a saddle. This is your tool. You'll learn to use it. You'll learn to care for it. It keeps you alive. You keep it working. Clear. The boys nodded. Good. Everyone grab a saddle. Take it to the corral. Franz reached for the nearest saddle and immediately understood the first problem. The thing weighed 40 pounds, maybe more. Solid leather and wood and metal. He tried to lift it, struggled, felt his face flush with the effort and the shame of weakness. He expected ridicule. In Hitler, youth weakness had always drawn contempt. The strong mocked the weak to make themselves feel stronger. That was how it worked. That was how you built men. But Rusty just walked over calm and unhurried. He did not take the saddle away, did not tell Franz he was doing it wrong. Just stood beside him and demonstrated. Brace it against your hip, Rusty said, positioning the saddle. Let your legs carry it. Your arms are just steadying, like this. He showed Franz the motion, hips supporting the weight, legs providing the power, arms balancing, physics instead of brute strength. Franz tried again. This time the saddle felt manageable, still heavy but possible. Better, Rusty said. Then he moved to help another boy struggling with a bridle, offering the same patient instruction. Franz carried the saddle to the corral, something shifting inside him. He had expected punishment for weakness. Instead, he had received teaching. The difference felt enormous. The corral held 24 horses, not the magnificent war horses of Franz's imagination. These were working animals, shorter, stockier, with intelligent eyes and wary postures. They had been doing this longer than any of the boys. Jimmy, one of the ranch hands, was a man of about 30 with sun-weathered skin and a permanent squint from years of looking at horizons. He spoke very little. When he did speak, other people listened. He picked out horses for each boy, calm horses, experienced horses, horses that would tolerate inexperience without becoming dangerous. "This is Red," Jimmy said, handing Franz the reins of a sorrel gelding. "He'll take care of you if you don't do anything stupid." Red looked at Franz with dark eyes that seemed to hold judgment. The horse was maybe 15 hands high, lean, and muscled, with a scar on his left shoulder from some old injury. "Ever been on a horse?" Jimmy asked. Franz shook his head. "Well, you're about to learn." Jimmy demonstrated how to saddle the horse, how to position the blanket, how to swing the saddle up, how to cinch it tight without over-tightening, how to adjust the stirrups. Franz watched carefully. This was survival information. In Hitler Youth, they had learned rifle assembly and grenade throwing, skills for killing. Here he was learning skills for living, for working, for being useful in a way that built rather than destroyed. When all 17 boys had their horses saddled, Rusty demonstrated how to mount, how to put your foot in the stirrup, how to swing your leg over, how to settle into the saddle without spooking the animal. "Your horse ain't a machine," Rusty said. "It's got a mind, got feelings. You treat it right, it'll work with you. Treat it mean, it'll find ways to make your life hell. Same as people." Franz mounted Red carefully. The ground suddenly seemed very far away. The horse shifted beneath him, adjusting to the new weight, and Franz grabbed the saddle horn instinctively. "That's fine," Rusty said. "Hold on till you get your balance. No shame in it." Around him, other boys were mounting with varying degrees of success. Otto got on smoothly. Klaus nearly fell off the other side. Heinrich froze halfway up, paralyzed by fear of heights. The Cowboys helped where needed. No mockery, no impatience, just steady hands and quiet instruction. The contrast to military training was stark. In the Wehrmacht, failure was punished. Here it was simply corrected. They rode that first day for only an hour, just walking the horses around the corral, learning to sit, learning to balance, learning how the horse moved beneath them and how to move with it. Franz expected to be sore. He was not prepared for the reality. That night he could barely walk. Muscles he did not know he had screamed in protest. Every step sent jolts of pain through his thighs and lower back. But every boy was equally sore. They limped to dinner like old men, sat down carefully, groaned when they stood up. The Cowboys watched with expressions that might have been sympathy or might have been suppressed amusement. Hard to tell. After dinner, Rusty approached the table where the Germans sat nursing their soreness. "Gets easier," he said. "Your bodies will adapt. Give it 3 days." "3 days," Klaus muttered in German. "I'll be dead in 3 days." Otto translated this for Rusty, who smiled slightly. "Then you'll die in the saddle like a cowboy. Worse ways to go." The boys were not sure if this was a joke or a threat, but Rusty's eyes held something that might have been kindness, or just acknowledgement that suffering was part of the process. That pain preceded competence. That night, Otto played his harmonica again, this time louder. The melody was still mournful but also defiant, a declaration that they were still alive, still capable of making music despite everything. From the Cowboys' quarters came the sound of a guitar. Jimmy was playing, a Texas ballad about loneliness and open plains. The two instruments did not play together, but they existed in the same space, parallel rather than opposed. Franz lay on his cot and listened and thought about the strangest thing. He was a prisoner of war in enemy territory, but somehow he felt safer than he had in months. No bombs, no officers screaming, no constant threat of violence for infractions real or imagined. Just work, just horses, just the brutal honesty of physical labor that demanded everything and gave back competence. It was not freedom, but it was not the cage he had expected either. By the end of the first week, the boys could ride without falling off. Not well, not gracefully, but functionally. They could saddle their horses without help, could bridle them, could mount and dismount without assistance. Progress measured in small increments, in blisters that hardened into calluses, in muscles that stopped screaming and started working, in the slow, grudging respect that came from the cowboys who saw boys becoming something more. Rusty began teaching them the actual work of ranching, how to herd cattle, how to read the animal's body language, how to position your horse to guide rather than chase. Cattle are stupid, but not that stupid, Rusty explained. They'll go where they want unless you convince them your way is better. You can't force them. Too many too stubborn, but you can guide them. Make them think it was their idea. Franz found this fascinating. The psychology of it. The way you had to think like the animal, anticipate its movements, position yourself not where it was, but where it would be. It required patience, observation, empathy of a sort, understanding that the cattle had their own logic, their own motivations, and your job was to work with that, not against it. This was so different from everything Nazi ideology had taught. Might makes right. The strong dominate the weak. Force solves all problems. But here, force accomplished nothing. A man on a horse could not physically move 1,500 pounds of bull that did not want to move. But that same man, using intelligence and positioning and patience, could make the bull think moving was its own idea. There was a lesson in this. Franz was not sure he understood it yet, but he felt it. Something about power and persuasion and the difference between breaking something and building something. The work was hard, harder than anything Franz had experienced. Herding cattle across rough terrain and brutal heat, mending fences under the merciless sun, hauling water, cleaning stalls. Endless, exhausting physical labor that left him too tired to think, too tired to dream, too tired to remember he was supposed to hate these people. But the work was also honest. There was no ideology in fixing a fence, no propaganda in herding cattle, just a task that needed doing and the satisfaction of doing it well. Franz began to take pride in his work, in roping a calf cleanly, in spotting a sick cow before anyone else noticed, in anticipating Rusty's instructions and having the task half done before being asked. This pride was different from the pride he had felt in Hitler Youth. That had been pride in belonging, in wearing the uniform, in being part of something larger and more important than himself. This was pride in competence, in being good at something difficult, in earning respect through ability rather than affiliation. And slowly and perceptibly, that shift changed everything. By the third week, the boys began to laugh, not nervous laughter, real laughter, the kind that came from genuine amusement rather than fear. Otto dropped a rope while trying to lasso a fence post for practice. The rope landed in a perfect loop around his own feet. He tripped, fell flat on his face in the dust, and lay there for a moment in stunned surprise. Then he started laughing, great wheezing laughs that shook his whole body, and the other boys laughed with him, and the cowboys laughed too. Not mocking laughter, shared laughter. The kind that says, we've all been there, we all know how that feels, and isn't it absurd how seriously we take ourselves? That moment mattered more than Franz could articulate. In Hitler, youth mistakes had been shameful. Weakness was sin. Failure deserved punishment. But here failure was just failure. A moment to learn from, laugh about, and move past. The boys were not being trained as soldiers. They were being trained as cowboys. And cowboys apparently were allowed to be human. The evenings developed their own rhythm. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the day's work was assessed, the cowboys and the boys would gather in the space between the bunkhouse and the main house. Not together exactly. The cowboys still kept some distance, but within sight, within hearing. Jimmy would bring his guitar. Otto would pull out his harmonica. At first they played separately. American songs and German songs, different traditions, different histories, but music has its own language, its own logic. After a few nights, the two instruments began to find common ground. A chord progression that worked in both styles. A rhythm that could carry both melodies. The boys would sit and listen to Jimmy play Texas ballads about lost love and wide open spaces. The cowboys would listen to Otto play Rhine River songs about longing and homeland. No one translated the words. The languages remained separate, but the emotions were universal. Loneliness, loss, hope. The things that connect all humans regardless of which side of a war they fight on. Rusty watched these evening gatherings with something that might have been satisfaction. He never participated, just watched from the porch of the main house, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and observing the boys transform. Because they were transforming. The swagger of Hitler Youth was fading, the rigid posture, the aggressive masculinity that demanded dominance. It was being replaced by something steadier, something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself through violence or volume. The boys were learning a different model of strength, one built on competence rather than conquest, on teaching rather than dominating, on earning respect through work rather than demanding it through fear. They did not have words for this yet, but they felt it. In the way Rusty corrected their mistakes with patience instead of punishment. In the way Jimmy showed them the same rope trick 5 times without frustration. In the way Walt praised good work with a simple nod that somehow meant more than any medal. These cowboys were harder than any Wehrmacht officer Franz had known. They worked longer hours, endured harsher conditions, pushed through pain that would have hospitalized soldiers. But they did it without cruelty, without needing to hurt others to feel strong, without the constant performance of dominance that had defined every male space Franz had known. This was masculinity without the posturing, strength without the brutality, power that did not need to prove itself. And for boys raised on Nazi ideals of conquest and domination, this was revolutionary. Franz lay in his bunk that third week and wrote a letter to his mother. If she was still alive, if Stuttgart still stood, if the mail system could carry a letter from enemy territory to a bombed-out German city. He wrote, "Mother, I am alive and I am learning to be a cowboy. I do not know how to explain what this means, but I think you would be proud, not of the boy who marched in uniform and shouted slogans, but of the boy who can rope a calf and mend a fence and treat a horse with respect. I think this is what a man is supposed to be, not a soldier, a builder, and I am learning to build." He never sent the letter. The censors would have rejected it. But writing it helped, clarified something, acknowledged the transformation happening inside him, whether he wanted it or not. The ranch was changing him. The Cowboys were changing him. Texas was changing him. And he was not sure if that made him a traitor or simply a boy finally learning what strength actually meant. Down. August brought heat that made July look mild. The sun turned the sky white. The air shimmered. Working cattle in that heat required starting before dawn and stopping at midday, resuming only when the sun began its descent. The boys adapted. Their bodies soft from months in transit camps hardened. Muscles developed. Skin tanned. They moved differently now. The bow-legged swagger of men who spent their days in saddles. The economy of motion that came from understanding their tools. Franz could read cattle now, could tell from body language when a cow was about to bolt, when a bull was in a mood, when the herd was settled or restless. This was knowledge earned through observation and mistakes, through being charged by an angry cow and learning to spot the warning signs, through losing a calf in brush and learning to track. Rusty took Franz, Otto, and Klaus on a cattle drive to a neighboring ranch 60 miles north. The journey required 3 days on horseback camping under open sky. The first time any of the boys had been more than a few hundred yards from the guarded bunkhouse. They rode through country that seemed endless, rolling hills covered in scrub brush, dry creek beds that would run wild in spring, rock formations that looked like sculptures, sky so big it hurt to look at. On the second night, camped beside a creek that held just enough water to refresh the horses, Rusty told them his story. He spoke slowly, his English still carrying the accent of his childhood. He had left Poland at 12 years old. His father was dead. His mother was dying. His older brother had been conscripted into an army that ground up young men for wars that meant nothing. Rusty had walked across Europe, worked ships across the Atlantic, and ended up in Texas because it was far enough from everything he needed to escape. "I came here with nothing," Rusty said, staring into the campfire. "No money, no English, no skills except I could work hard and take instruction. The cowboys who taught me, they didn't care where I came from. Didn't care about my accent or my name or what country I'd left behind. They cared if I could do the work, if I could learn, if I could pull my weight." He paused, rolling a cigarette with practiced movements. "This is what America is supposed to be. Not always what it is, mind you, but what it's supposed to be. A place where your past matters less than your present, where you earn your place through deeds, not birthright. Franz listened, trying to reconcile this with everything Berlin had taught. Nazi ideology was all about birthright, about blood and soil, about some people being inherently superior and others inherently inferior, about destiny being written in genetics. But here was Rusty, Polish immigrant, no family, no connections, and he had built a life through competence and character. He was respected by men who had been born in Texas, whose families had ranched here for generations. Not because of what he was, because of what he did. Klaus asked the question that had been haunting all of them. Why treat us like this? We're the enemy. We're German. You could work us like slaves and no one would stop you. Rusty finished rolling his cigarette, lit it, took a long drag. Then he said something none of the boys ever forgot. Hate is easy. Teaching takes effort. And I'd rather build cowboys than break boys. The words hung in the Texas night air. Franz thought about them as he lay in his bedroll, looking at stars so bright and numerous they seemed fake. He thought about all the ways hate had been easy, how simple it was to blame Jews for Germany's problems, to see Slavs as subhuman, to believe that conquest proved superiority. Hate required no thought, no nuance, no empathy, just simple, brutal certainty. But teaching required patience, understanding, the belief that the other person was capable of growth. Teaching was an investment in someone else's future, and you did not invest in something you thought was worthless. Rusty believed they could become cowboys, believed they were worth the effort of teaching, and that belief, simple as it seemed, challenged everything. If a Polish immigrant could teach German prisoners to be cowboys, if enemy boys could learn respect and competence from enemy men, if shared work could build brotherhood across the chasm of war, then what had all the fighting been for? What were all the lies about racial superiority worth? What did conquest prove if the conquered could simply become equals through patient instruction? Franz did not sleep much that night. His mind turned over questions he had no answers for. Questions that would have gotten him shot in Germany for even asking. Dangerous questions about the difference between the strength that dominates and the strength that builds. By September, the ranch operated like a well-oiled machine. The boys worked alongside the cowboys with easy familiarity. They knew each other's rhythms, anticipated each other's moves, communicated through gestures and tones that transcended language barriers. Visitors to the ranch could barely distinguish prisoners from hands. All wore the same dusty jeans, sweat-stained hats, and worn boots. All moved with the same economical grace. All bore the same calluses and scars. The war felt distant. News reached them through radio and newspapers. The Allies pushing through France, the Soviets advancing on Poland, the Reich collapsing in slow motion. But on the ranch, time moved differently, marked by seasons and cattle drives and the endless work that defined their days. Jimmy's younger brother David had been fighting in Europe. The letters came sporadically. Each one carried fear that it might be the last. In August, a letter mentioned fighting near Aachen. In September, nothing came. The silence was terrible. Jimmy grew quieter, worked harder, pushed himself and the horses and anyone near him with grim determination. One evening, Otto found Jimmy alone by the corral staring at nothing. Otto did not speak much English. Jimmy spoke no German. But grief has its own language. Otto pulled out his harmonica and played. Something slow, something mournful. A melody about soldiers who never came home. About mothers who waited at train stations for sons who would never arrive. About the universal waste of war. Jimmy listened. When Otto finished, he looked at the German boy and said, "My brother's out there, fighting your people. Maybe already dead." Otto nodded. He understood enough. "My father," he said in halting English. "Bomb, dead. My brother may be dead too. No letters, long time." The two sat in silence, an American and a German, both victims of the same machine, both losing people they loved to an abstraction called war that felt very concrete when it took your family. "I don't hate you," Jimmy said finally. "Should probably, but I don't. You're just a kid, like David was a kid before they sent him off." Otto did not catch all the words, but he understood the tone, the resignation, the acknowledgement that they were both trapped in something larger than themselves. something that did not care about their individuality or humanity. "I am sorry," Otto said. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. Jimmy nodded, then he put his hand on Otto's shoulder for just a moment and walked away. That brief interaction changed something. The boys had been abstractions to some of the cowboys, the enemy, Germans, Nazis. But seeing Jimmy's grief, seeing how it mirrored Otto's, reminded everyone that humanity was not determined by uniform or flag. The following week, Jimmy taught Otto to play guitar. Basic chords, simple progressions. They would sit together in the evenings, Jimmy's fingers guiding Otto's, showing him where to press, how to strum, building something together from shared loss. October brought cooler weather and the biggest project of the season, repairing fences across the entire ranch. Miles and miles of barbed wire that needed checking, tightening, replacing. The work was tedious and dangerous. Barbed wire cut hands, posts needed digging in hard ground. The sun still beat down even as temperatures dropped. But fences were essential. Without them, cattle wandered, were stolen, got lost. The fence was the boundary between order and chaos. Franz worked a section with Walt, a taciturn cowboy in his 50s who had been ranching since he was younger than Franz. Walt spoke maybe 10 words a day, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed Franz how to dig a proper post hole, how to set the post so it would last years, how to string wire tight without snapping it, how to work smart instead of just hard. One afternoon, Franz made a mistake. He set a post wrong, it tilted. When Walt tested the wire, the whole section sagged. Franz waited for the explosion, for punishment, for the anger that came when you wasted time and resources. Walt just looked at the post, looked at Franz. Then without a word, he showed Franz how to reset it, dug out the hole deeper, packed it proper, made it right. "Mistakes happen," Walt said. One of his 10 daily words. "Fixing them is what matters." That was all. No lecture, no shame, just acknowledgement that learning meant error and error meant opportunity. Franz worked twice as hard the rest of that day, not because he was afraid, because he wanted to prove that the teaching was not wasted, that he could become competent, that he was worth the investment of patience. That evening, Walt nodded to him once. A simple gesture, but Franz felt it like a medal, proof that he was becoming what the Cowboys needed, not a prisoner, a hand. The boys' English improved dramatically. Daily immersion worked faster than any classroom. They learned working vocabulary first, the words for tools and actions and problems. Then social vocabulary, how to joke, how to tell stories, how to participate in the evening gatherings that had become ritual. They also learned to read the silences. Cowboys did not use words when gestures would do. A nod meant approval. A head shake meant no. A certain look meant stop what you're doing. Another look meant come help. This economy of communication was its own language, more efficient than German with all its compound words, more honest than propaganda with all its manipulation. Just direct, simple communication between men who respected each other enough not to waste time. November brought news that chilled, despite the dropping temperatures. David, Jimmy's brother, was missing in action. Not confirmed dead, just missing, which meant he could be alive or dead, or captured or blown apart so thoroughly there was nothing to find. The uncertainty was worse than grief. At least grief had finality. This was limbo. Hope without evidence. Fear without confirmation. Jimmy stopped playing guitar. Stopped talking beyond what work required. His face became a mask, revealing nothing containing everything. The boys watched this and understood. They had experienced the same uncertainty. Letters that stopped coming. Families that might be alive or dead. Cities that might exist or be rubble. Otto wanted to offer comfort, but did not know how. What could an enemy prisoner say to a man whose brother was missing? Sorry seemed insultingly inadequate. Instead, Otto did the only thing he could. He worked harder, took on extra tasks, tried to make Jimmy's burden lighter through action, since words failed. Franz noticed this, noticed how all the boys began working harder in Jimmy's presence, taking on tasks without being asked, anticipating needs, showing through labor what they could not express through language. It was respect, earned and given freely, and somehow the Cowboys noticed too. The distance that had existed, the professional separation between captors and captives, began to erode. Not completely. The boys still slept in a separate bunkhouse, still had guards accompany them to town, still wore clothing marked with PW for prisoner of war. The realities of captivity remained, but within those boundaries something approaching brotherhood had developed, built not through shared ideology or enforced camaraderie, but through shared work and mutual respect. By December, Franz could rope as well as some of the ranch hands. Otto could read cattle like he'd been born to it. Klaus, who had been the most skeptical, the most convinced this was all a trick, had become the hardest worker, as if trying to earn his way out of captivity through sheer competence. The ranch owner, Samuel Hardwick, visited more frequently. He was an older man, mid-60s, with the bearing of someone who had built something substantial and knew its worth. He had lost both sons to the Pacific Theater. One confirmed dead at Guadalcanal, the other missing after Iwo Jima. He should have hated Germans, should have seen them as abstract representatives of the enemy that had taken his children. But watching them work, seeing them transform from sullen prisoners to competent hands, something shifted in him. One evening he asked Rusty about them. "You think they're learning?" "Learning," Rusty replied. "They're becoming cowboys. That's more than learning. That's transformation." Hardwick nodded slowly. "My boys would have liked them, would have been their age before the war. They always wanted help on the ranch." The statement hung in the air. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. These German boys were not so different from the American boys who had died. All of them were young. All of them had been told lies by old men. All of them had been used as tools for purposes they barely understood. The difference was arbitrary. Geography, language, the accident of which nation they had been born into. None of them had chosen this war. They had simply been caught in its machinery. December also brought Christmas planning. The Cowboys talked about traditions, about decorating the bunkhouse, about a special meal, about gifts exchanged. The German boys listened with confusion. Christmas under the Nazis had been transformed into a political celebration, about the Führer and the Reich, about Germanic traditions stripped of Christian meaning. It was duty dressed as festivity. But the Cowboys talked about Christmas with genuine warmth, about family, about gratitude, about taking one day to acknowledge blessings in a hard world. Rusty asked if the boys wanted to participate, create their own decorations, contribute to the meal, be part of the celebration rather than separate from it. The boys agreed, uncertain what this meant, but willing to try. On Christmas Eve, they gathered in the main house for the first time. Cowboys and prisoners, captors and captives, Americans and Germans, all sitting at the same long table. The meal was simple but abundant. Roasted beef, potatoes, vegetables from the winter garden, cornbread, peach cobbler made from canned fruit, coffee and whiskey for those who wanted it. Hardwick stood at the head of the table. He was not a man who made speeches, but this night required words. "This has been a hard year," he said. "We've all lost people. We've all suffered. And this war isn't over. More loss is coming." He paused, looking at the faces around his table. Cowboys and boys, Americans and Germans, all marked by war in different ways. But tonight we're not at war. Tonight we're men sharing a meal. Tomorrow we go back to our roles. But tonight we remember that before we were enemies, we were human. And maybe when this is all over, we can be human again. It was not a prayer, not quite, but it served the same purpose: acknowledgement of suffering and hope for something better. They ate together, talked in the mix of English and German that had become their common language, shared stories carefully edited to avoid the worst memories, found common ground in the universal experiences of work and weather and horses. Otto played his harmonica, Jimmy played his guitar. They had been practicing together for weeks. They played Christmas songs known in both languages: Silent Night, which was German originally, Joy to the World, which was English but universal. The music filled the room, filled the hearts of men who had forgotten what peace felt like. And for one night in a ranch house in Texas, the war felt impossibly far away. Franz sat at that table and felt something he had not felt since before the war. Belonging, not the forced belonging of Hitler Youth where conformity was demanded, but the organic belonging that came from earning your place, from proving your worth, from being accepted not despite being German, but because he had become something more than his nationality. He was a cowboy, a hand, a member of the crew, and that identity earned through work and respect meant more than any uniform or flag. That night, he wrote another letter to his mother. Still unsent, still just words on paper that helped him process what was happening. Mother, today I sat at a table with Americans and felt more at home than I ever did in Germany. I do not know if that makes me a traitor or simply a boy learning the difference between forced loyalty and earned respect. Rusty says a man is defined by his actions, not his origins, by what he builds, not what he destroys. I think I am learning to build, and I think you would understand why that matters more than conquest. The letter stayed in his footlocker with the others, a record of transformation that he might never be able to share but needed to document, proof that he had been changed by this place and these people in ways that could never be undone. So, January 1945 arrived with the cold that surprised the Cowboys and shocked the German boys. Texas was supposed to be warm, but winter in South Texas brought freezing temperatures and occasional ice storms that turned the ranch into a crystalline landscape of deadly beauty. Work continued. Cattle still needed feeding. Water sources had to be checked to ensure they had not frozen solid. Fences still needed mending. Cold made every task harder, more dangerous, more demanding of competence. The boys had become indispensable. They knew the ranch as well as men who had worked it for years. They understood the cattle, the horses, the rhythms of seasons. Hardwick told Rusty he had never had a better crew. But everyone knew it could not last. The war in Europe was collapsing. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. Soon the boys would be sent home, or to other camps, or kept as prisoners indefinitely while bureaucracies processed the end of war. The future was uncertain, so they focused on the present, on each day's work, on maintaining the routines that had given their lives structure and meaning. February brought devastating news through the radio. Dresden firebombed, the city where Klaus had family. No word on survivors, just reports of unimaginable destruction. Klaus disappeared for 3 days. Not escaped, just withdrew. Stopped talking, stopped eating. Sat in the bunkhouse staring at walls. The Cowboys gave him space. But they also made sure he was not alone. Someone was always nearby, not hovering, just present, available if needed. On the 3rd day, Rusty sat down beside Klaus. Did not speak at first, just sat. Finally, Klaus spoke in German. Franz translated later. Everything is gone. Everyone, my mother, my little sister, the house I grew up in. All of it burned. Rusty nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Are you? Klaus's voice was raw. You're winning. We're losing. My city burned so yours could be safe. That's true, Rusty acknowledged. And it's terrible. War is terrible. Innocent people suffer while old men stay safe. Your family, Jimmy's brother, Hardwick's sons, my friends back in Poland who died before I left. All of it is waste. He paused, choosing words carefully. But you surviving, that's not waste. You building a life after this, that's not waste. The only way to honor the dead is to make sure their deaths weren't for nothing. You do that by becoming the best man you can be, by building instead of destroying, by teaching your children better than you were taught. Klaus did not respond immediately, but slowly over the following days he emerged from his grief. Not healed. Grief does not heal so simply. But functional, able to work, able to continue. And the work mattered. It was the only thing that made sense when nothing else did. The physical demands of ranching did not care about politics or nationality or who was winning the war. They just required competence and effort. And in that requirement, there was a kind of peace. By March, everyone on the ranch knew the end was near. The news was undeniable. Allied forces crossing the Rhine, Soviets surrounding Berlin, Germany's collapse happening in real time through radio reports that came daily now. The boys listened with complicated emotions. Relief that the dying would stop, horror at what awaited them at home, uncertainty about their futures, and something else, something harder to name. Grief for the end of this strange interlude where they had become something other than soldiers or prisoners, where they had simply been cowboys learning their trade from men who respected them enough to teach. In April, the final orders came. The boys would be transferred to a larger processing camp, then eventually repatriated to Germany. The bureaucratic language made it sound simple, but everyone knew the reality would be chaos. Germany was rubble. Families were scattered. The infrastructure of normal life had collapsed. The boys would be returning not to home, but to ruins, to a nation that had to learn how to lose, to a future that was blank and terrifying. Hardwick arranged a final meal, the last gathering before the trucks came. He butchered a steer for the occasion. The Cowboys prepared the feast like they were sending off family, because in a strange way, that was what this was. The meal stretched across hours. Stories were told, jokes were shared. The harmonica and guitar played together one last time, creating music that belonged to both traditions and neither. After dinner, Rusty stood. He was not a speechmaker, but this moment required words. "You boys came here as prisoners," he said. "You're leaving as cowboys. That might not seem like much to some people, but it means everything to us. A cowboy is someone who does hard work with competence and integrity, someone who can be trusted, someone who treats animals and people with respect. You've become that. Be proud of it." He paused, looking at each boy in turn. "The world you're going back to is broken, harder than anything you faced here. But you've learned how to work hard, how to build instead of destroy, how to earn respect through actions. Take that with you, teach it to your children. Make sure the next generation learns to build instead of conquer." Then Rusty did something none of them expected. He shook each boy's hand, looked them in the eye, told them they would always have a place on the ranch if they ever returned to Texas. It was not a promise that could be kept. The boys were enemy nationals. Immigration would be nearly impossible. But the offer mattered anyway. The acknowledgement that they had earned their place, that they were welcome, that they belonged. The morning of departure arrived with terrible inevitability. The boys packed their few belongings. Dressed in the same clothes they had arrived in, though the uniforms now hung loose on frames hardened by months of ranch work. They assembled outside the bunkhouse one last time. The Cowboys stood watching, not at attention, not formally, just standing, bearing witness to an ending. Franz looked at the ranch, memorizing details. The barn where he had learned to saddle a horse. The corral where he had roped his first calf. The bunkhouse where he had laughed harder than he ever had in Germany. The vast Texas sky that had seemed alien and now felt like home. Otto pulled out his harmonica and played. Not a German song, not an American song. Something new. A melody he had created from his time here. Something that captured the strange beauty of transformation. Of enemies becoming cowboys. Of boys becoming men through work instead of war. The truck engine started. The sound was final, inevitable. One by one, the boys climbed into the truck bed. Each paused, looked back, tried to hold the memory. As the truck rolled through the gate, Franz watched the Cowboys shrink into the distance. Rusty stood apart from the others, one hand raised, not waving, just raised. A cowboy's gesture of farewell. The dust settled, the sound faded, and 17 boys who had arrived as prisoners were leaving as something else entirely, changed in ways that could never be unchanged, carrying lessons that would ripple through decades. The boys returned to a Germany that barely existed. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Families were scattered across occupation zones. Food was scarce. Hope was scarcer. Franz spent 3 months in a processing camp before being released. He searched for his mother in Stuttgart and found her alive in a cellar shelter. Their reunion was quiet. Too much had happened for celebration. But she was alive, and he was alive, and that was enough. He showed her the letters he had written, the ones about cowboys and ranching and learning to build instead of destroy. She read them with tears streaming down her face. "You became a man," she said, "not the man Berlin wanted, the man I hoped you would be." Franz tried to find work in the ruins of Germany, but there was nothing, just rubble and hunger and the grim work of surviving day to day. He remembered Texas, remembered open sky and honest work, remembered Rusty saying that America was a place where your past mattered less than your present. In 1947, using money saved from black market dealings and help from aid organizations, Franz immigrated to America. It took 2 years of paperwork and persistence, but he made it. He worked ranches across the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, eventually Texas again. He never returned to the ranch outside Hebronville. Too many ghosts, too much memory, but he carried the lessons everywhere he went. He taught other green hands with the same patience Rusty had shown him. He judged men by their blisters, not their birthplace. He built a life based on competence and integrity and the cowboy values that had saved him when he was 15 and lost. Otto rebuilt his town in the Ruhr Valley. He brought American pragmatism to German efficiency, created businesses, employed people, taught his children that strength meant building, not destroying, that the measure of a man was what he created, not what he conquered. He kept his harmonica, played it sometimes in the evenings, the same melodies from the Texas ranch, music that reminded him that enemies could become brothers through shared work and mutual respect. Klaus found his sister alive but changed, found his mother dead in the firebombing. He never quite recovered from the grief, but he built a life anyway. Farmed land outside Dresden, taught his children to question propaganda, to think for themselves, to understand that the enemy was rarely what you were told. He wrote to Franz once in the 1950s. The letter was brief, just remember Texas, remember that there's another way to be men, remember that building matters more than breaking. Franz kept that letter for the rest of his life. Rusty continued cowboying until his body gave out. He trained other hands, taught other boys, some German, some American, some Mexican, all treated with the same patient competence. He never spoke much about the German prisoners. When asked, he would shrug and say they were just hands, good hands. But those who knew him understood. He had made a choice in the summer of 1944, to see boys instead of enemies, to teach instead of punish, to build cowboys instead of breaking prisoners. And that choice had rippled outward, through the boys who became men, through their children who learned different values, through generations who understood that strength did not require cruelty, that masculinity could be gentle without being weak, that the measure of a man was what he built, not what he destroyed. The ranch itself continued until the 1980s. Then the Hardwick family sold it to developers. The land was subdivided. The bunkhouse was torn down. The corral was paved over for a shopping center. But the story remained, passed down through families, remembered in letters and faded photographs, told to grandchildren who needed to understand that even in war, humanity could persist, that the choice to mentor instead of exploit created a legacy that outlasted any battlefield, that enemies could become brothers through shared work and mutual respect, that 17 German boys and a Polish cowboy had proven something essential about human nature. In 2003, Franz died in a nursing home in Santa Fe. He was 74. He had lived a good life, built things, taught people, left the world slightly better than he found it. In his belongings, they found a worn photograph, 17 boys standing in front of a barn, dusty, bow-legged, squinting in Texas sun, looking like cowboys. On the back in faded pencil, he had written, "Berlin told us to conquer the world. Texas taught us how to ride it. This was where I learned to be a man." The photograph was framed, passed to his children, his grandchildren, a reminder that transformation is possible, that enemies can become brothers, that the strongest men are those who choose to build instead of break. And in that lesson, in that simple photograph of 17 German boys who became Texas cowboys, lay a truth worth remembering, that hate is easy, teaching takes effort, and the men who choose to teach, who choose to build, who choose to see potential instead of enemy, those are the men who change the world. One rope knot at a time, one patient instruction, one act of brotherhood that transcends nationality and proves that humanity is stronger than propaganda. That work can unite what war divides. That cowboys and prisoners can become simply men doing hard work together under a Texas sky. That is the legacy of the ranch outside Hebronville. That is what Rusty and 17 German boys proved in the summer of 1944. And that is a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into every generation that needs to understand the difference between the strength that destroys and the strength that builds. Forever. The end.